Good morning, good afternoon. Going to give a couple minutes for everyone to um, log in and get into the webinar, and then we will get started. So just be patient. We will get started momentarily. Again, just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to give it one more minute to allow people to get into the webinar, and then we will begin. All right, again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Kernan. I'm the Sales Development Manager here at TPGi. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for VPAT 101, Introduction to the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. Just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. This session is being recorded, and we will email everyone the recording after the event. We have captions available, so feel free to use them as needed. We will have time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A box. We'll answer as many questions as we can throughout the presentation and try to get to any additional questions at the end of the presentation. Please do not put questions into the chat. We tend to miss them when they come into the chat. Lastly, I'd also like to mention if anyone needs any accessibility support, training, usability testing, a VPAT, I will send out an email for Ida, who you can reach out to, and we will get you connected with one of your account executives. Again, with that, I will let our presenter, Brian Elton, get started with an introduction, and we will get going. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Elton. I am the Training Practice Manager at TPGi. My pleasure to be with you here today to talk about VPATs. So we call this VPAT 101, just an introduction to the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And as was mentioned, please feel free to ask questions as we go. I'll do my best to answer as we move along. But if there are too many questions, I may not be able to fit them in, so we'll save those to the end. All right, so what are we going to cover today? Well, we'll have a quick introduction to the VPAT, what it is essentially. We'll talk about why we should use a VPAT, along with a bit of a short history, just how it came into existence. And then we'll dive into the different parts of the VPAT. As much as possible, we are just doing an introduction, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail in there, but certainly just an understanding of the different parts of the VPAT, what makes up that that template. We can talk a little bit of how do we get a VPAT report, and even when we should get that report. All right, so let's start off with what is the VPAT? Well, I've already stated what VPAT stands for. It stands for the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is a registered trademark of the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI Council. And it really is just that, it's a template. So we have, VPAT is the common terminology that we use when discussing this subject, but really it's just the template that we'd fill out to create an accessibility conformance report. Right, so we use a template, we fill it all out, and then what we have at the other end of that, the output of that, is this accessibility conformance report. Those two things tend to get used interchangeably, and quite often, actually, VPAT is used more often than ACR. but they are, as you understand, the same sort of thing. But really what this conformance report is like an accessibility resume for your digital products, right? It's something that is describing the level of accessibility in your product. There are different types of digital products that can be covered in a VPAT. So first of all, websites and web applications, software, which includes mobile applications, hardware, things like kiosks, personal computers, phones, office machines, and then content and functionality. So any sort of like communication platforms, video, email, training content, documents, even content creation tools. And within all these types, there is quite a wide range of content and functions. And, in a world that's now more digital than ever, it's more important than ever for these things to work well for people with disabilities. So given that accessibility is important, why should we use a VPAT format for reporting on it? As a product owner, you may have potential customers or buyers looking for documentation on how accessible your product is. And that really could be provided in any manner. So why should we use a VPAT? Well, primarily because the VPAT is a standardized way of reporting. Right? So customers and buyers can make those preliminary assessments of ICT, which is information communication technology, through these ICT products and services in a known format, right? So it makes it easier to compare different products from different sellers, right? It has the same template, the same information. You're really, starting to compare apples to apples. And then for those that are creating the products or selling the products, it saves time because you would prepare this, this report once, and then you can use it for multiple buyers or customers, right? And so it makes it easier for you to then compete for business, and particularly important for public sector customers, which we'll talk about shortly. But there are also some other benefits to using a VPAT. It shows transparency, and it gives a demonstration of your company's commitment to accessibility, right? If you are doing the things that you need to do in order to create a VPAT or accessibility conformance report, and you have that made available, it's showing that you have taken, that accessibility is important to you and to your company. You can also use that result, that a conformance report, as a baseline for your internal accessibility policy. You can sort of flag where there are things that need to be addressed, and perhaps which items should be addressed sooner than others. So some other benefits aside from just the standardized reporting. So how did we arrive at this standardized report? Well, it began in 1998 with Section 508 in the United States for federal agencies, which made a requirement that they needed to buy accessible products. And so, how do they compare any two competing products? Well, in 2001, the template, the VPAT, was developed by the Information Technology Industry Council in collaboration with the US federal government to help create a way of being able to compare competing products. When we fast forward to 2007, the Section 508 had a refresh, and it was then harmonized with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, at the time version 2.0. And this then allowed a different way of being able to write the VPAT or fill in the VPAT, because now it was based in WCAG. And then most recently, the VPAT has been updated to version 2.5, because this now includes WCAG 2.2, which was released this previous October. Well, at least it included in some versions, because as we'll see here, there are different versions of the VPAT. It is no longer just for, U.S. federal government. There are 4 editions that it comes in depending on who your potential customers are. So we have the 508 edition. This is for the United States public sector, particularly federal public sector. It is still based on WCAG 2.0. It has not been updated, and then has a specific Section 508 component to it. There is the EU edition. This is for the European Union and Australia. It is with WCAG 2.1, and it has an additional section of EN 301549, which are, as we'll talk about shortly, about what these different sections contain. There's a WCAG edition, which is kind of your common denominator. So this is sort of the baseline edition. So this would be would involve all of the success criteria for WCAG 2.2. And then there's an international edition, which contains all of the different components that we've just talked about. So it has the WCAG baseline, and then Section 508 and EN 301549. One thing that's important to note is that when we're talking about the WCAG standard, WCAG 2.2 does include all of WCAG 2.1 and WCAG 2.0 success criteria. So we are backwards compatible in that manner. So what are the different parts of the VPAT? Well, a complete international VPAT has 4 sections to it. The first section is cover page, the product information, and that has important information such as the name of the product and the version. So if you do have something that is a versionable product, then we can list that there. We have the report date. How recent was this report created? And this is particularly important for things like websites that don't traditionally have a version. So really the date is what's important to know how relevant this report is. When we have a product version for perhaps a mobile application, and it is possible for us to look at our mobile device what version of this application we are using, it's very easy to know whether this VPAT is going to be appropriate for that application. But for a website, you don't know how many changes have been made on that website since the actual VPAT was created. So you at least want to know the date of the report so you know how recently it was done, and you can assess it through that. Then we also have evaluation methods that are used. So as a buyer or a customer, you'd want to make sure that the methods that are used in evaluating a product match or at least are close to what your users or what you would use, right? So for instance, if you know that your users are primarily JAWS screen reader users, but the report was completed using the NVDA screen reader, then you may want to dig a little bit further into whether it will conform just as well. Now, having said that, the report actually should be completed using multiple screen readers. And we'll talk about that sort of in the next bigger section. So I'm just going to address one of the questions here. So what does backward compatible mean? If WCAG criteria has changed between 2.1 and 2.2, or both deemed passing, or only updated criteria in 2.2? What I mean by backwards compatible is that when 2.2 was created, it added success criteria, but all those success criteria that were in 2.1 still applied, with the one exception of 4.1.1 parsing. That one was removed from 2.2, but everything else that was in 2.1 and 2.2 still exists in 2.1 and 2.0. All those success criteria still exist in 2.2. 2.2 added 9 new success criteria, but still maintained all the rest that were still there, with that one exception. And how is VPAT applicable to a SaaS solution where the product is constantly updated. Well, we can talk a bit about that later on. But if you have something that is fairly constantly updated, then you do want to, explain that within the VPAT and try to maintain the VPAT as much as possible. Okay, and then we also have some sections on what guidelines were used within, like the applicable standards and guidelines. So that may depend on the version, but with the international edition, we were going to do WCAG 2.2, level AA is what we would typically do. The next section is for WCAG success criteria. All right, so this is a table that contains all the different success criteria, first of all, for level A, and then the second table has all the success criteria for level AA. And it has, within that table, it has the criteria, and it also has columns for the conformance level and the remarks and explanations. Now, when we get the template, the template from ITI's website, it will have within each one of these cells lots of information. So in this case, what we're showing here is for non-text content, which is the first success criteria in WCAG. But there is, within that cell, it's telling you what this particular success criteria will apply to within the VPAT. So there's lots of parts to the VPAT, correct? There's web versions, there's non-web documents, there's software, there's hardware, authoring tools, support documents, all that sort of thing. So there are different parts of it that this particular success criteria could relate to. So hang on to that information for the moment, but just know that that's there. It also has, within the conformance level and the remarks and explanations, different types of products. So web, electronic documents, software, closed authoring tool. Now, typically when you write a VPAT, you're going to do it for one particular product. So instead of doing it for both a website and for a mobile application within one, you would do two separate VPATs for that. So really, this is just, you could use it where you have details for the different types of products, but we encourage you to have a separate VPAT for each of your products. Then we'll come back to the conformance level and the remarks and explanations in a moment. In the third section would be section 508 report. And so this is now where we have, things that are broken down a little bit differently than for WCAG. We have it broken down into functional based criteria, or this functional performance criteria. And some of that is very generalized, and there's other stuff that's very specific, right? So there are different sections for hardware, for software, et cetera. But, there may be things such as, the ability to reach forward as one of the criteria, or alternative user interfaces as one of the criteria in software. Sorry, excuse me, the ability to reach forward would be something like in hardware. And in this case, so we've got criteria in the functional performance criteria. You can see that there is some, there are ones like without vision or with limited vision, without perception of color. And what these are is a culmination of results from that WCAG table. So these conformance levels and remarks and explanations will be based on what was entered into the WCAG table. And that could include, and does in all these cases, multiple success criteria. So you would have to look at the different success criteria and their conformance levels and try and build what the sort of the conformance level for them as a group would be. So for example, the first criteria in the functional performance criteria section is without vision. That could include things like the success criteria of non-text content, right? And audio description. So one non-text content could just be for alternative text and images, and then audio descriptions for multimedia, pre-recorded video content. And then there's a bunch of others that would also apply to that. And we would then combine all of those together to determine what the conformance is of these criteria. And again, we'll talk about what that conformance level means in just a moment. The EN 301549 report for the European Union Australia version of this follows a very similar pattern. So we see functional performance statements instead of functional performance requirements or conformance, excuse me. Or criteria, I think is what it was, excuse me. But these are very similar. They're quite harmonized. And so, quite often you'll be able to fill out the Section 508 portion of the VPAT, and most of the information that you have filled out for that would apply to the EN 301549 report. So fortunately, that's one of the nice things, because they are quite harmonized. There's a lot of duplication of information, and therefore there's not as much of duplication of effort, right? So we can copy over a lot of the information that we've already created. But it also does go through the same, has the functional based criteria, it has generic requirements, has hardware requirements, software requirements, etc. So there's lots of different things that go into it. But at the core, most of the information is pulled from that WCAG success criteria. And then there's some additional ones that are very specific, because the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines doesn't cover all things having to do with hardware, doesn't cover all things having to do with software, even evaluating mobile applications for compliance with WCAG has a slight difference to it. So there is some additional work that goes into it, but a lot of that is based in what the information is that we put into WCAG. So I think a related question here is, as we know that for websites we follow WCAG, but may I know for desktop applications what criteria we need to follow? Is this the WCAG we need to follow for desktop applications or something else? For example, as mobile applications, you don't follow WCAG. Okay, so at its core, we base testing in the guidelines, in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And I know it can be a bit confusing sometimes, because they are web content, and that's their origins is in web. But those same success criteria are used for evaluating mobile applications, for desktop applications. There are some things that don't apply, because technically they are, it's not something that exists. So there are things within WCAG that don't apply to software and to desktop applications or mobile applications, but it is still the basis of evaluation. There are lots of efforts going on in the W3C right now to update the guidelines so that they are much more agnostic. So they aren't actually web-based. Will cover all digital technology, but that's the WCAG 3 is what's being worked towards, but that's many years away from being published. And so there are other efforts underway to help sort of bridge the gap between WCAG and ICT. And there's actually an effort called the WCAG to ICT task force within the W3C that does just that, where it's trying to map WCAG to ICT, which is, again, it's that information and communication technology, just a bucket of all types of applications and software and whatnot. So it is still that basis for desktop applications and mobile applications. Okay. So let's talk about ratings. So this goes under the conformance. I'm going to back up one slide. So in the middle column of the table is the conformance level, and this is what we would put in there. So there, one of 5 options. You can either put supports, and these are quoted directly from the VPAT from ITI. So if you put in the supports conformance level, that means the functionality of the product has at least one method that meets the criterion without known defects or meets with equivalent facilitation. Another value is partially supports. So some functionality of the product does not meet the criterion. Does not support means that the majority of the product functionality does not meet the criterion. And then there are a couple of of other ones, and not applicable means that the criterion is not relevant to the product and not evaluated. And this product has not been evaluated against the criterion. This is only possible to be used against WCAG 2.x or 2.2, whichever is your VPAT is for level AAA conformance items. Those are the only things that you can list as not evaluated. Everything else must be evaluated. And we look at those things, when we have a partially supports or a does not support, those are both really, they're fail ratings, right? So it means that there has been a success criteria that has failed in some manner. And so when we add in our remarks, which is the third column, it's really important that we explain why something got a partially supports or does not support. Because if these remarks are the things that are going to give the potential user or buyer understanding of how that impacts them. It could be that something has failed or it's partially supports, but the thing that it is partially supporting is not important to them as a user or not important to them as a buyer. And so they can look past it. But it is important to have the good remarks to show, to understand what the problem is with that particular success criterion. The support rating, you only really need to put remarks and explanations on that when you may need to explain that there was an alternative method. If we go back to that previous slide, I'll go back for 1 second. One of the definitions of supports is that it would meet with equivalent facilitation. So if there is something that has been put in place to help facilitate, and it is slightly different than maybe the normal user path or the typical user path, then you may want to explain why it's got that support rating, so that in case it's not particularly obvious. If there's a non-applicable rating, it means that the product may not have content that's relevant to that criterion. We see this perhaps a lot with anything having to do with multimedia. If your site doesn't have any videos or audio or anything like that, then any of the success criteria that have to do with multimedia can be marked as not applicable. There are different writing styles that are possible for filling in these remarks and explanations. And there isn't anything that's been specifically designed, but really the point is to give the readers of that report the information that they need to understand how accessible the product is, right? That is the baseline of all of that right now. So as an example, if we go back to the success criterion that we saw initially, the non-text content success criteria, if we see a conformance level of partially supports, okay, so that means that there's some of the content does not pass the non-text content success criteria. Then we look to the remarks and explanations to see why. And so this says non-text content that is presented to the user generally have a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose with some exceptions. These include some image-based controls with missing or inadequate text alternatives, some image-based links that do not sufficiently convey their purpose. So, that is somewhat vague, but is okay. Whenever possible, I would suggest that you give specifics, talk about specific sections or regions of a page, or just to ensure that somebody can actually track down these problems and to, ensure or determine whether they are actually a problem for them or their users. Question, does VPAT expect WCAG AA or also AAA compliance? VPAT is not where the expectation is set. The VPAT and the ACR are just the reporting. What the expectation is with compliance has to do with the reason why you're filling the VPAT out. So if you're trying to reach a certain level of legislated compliance, then you would go by what that is. So for instance, Section 508 for federal institutions in the United States, that is based on WCAG 2.0 AA. And so you would need to fill out the VPAT to that same criteria. So the VPAT has the ability to put information for WCAG 2.2 and single A, double A, triple A. It has space for all of those things, but you only would need to fill out the parts that are required for whatever conformance level you are needing to achieve based on legislation or what your potential buyers or customers are asking. Another question, is there an official industry accepted VPAT template or each entity creates their own? No, the VPAT is actually a registered trademark of ITI, the International Technology, oh shoot, I've forgotten the name of it now. The ITI Council. It is a trademark of them. They have templates that are freely downloadable and accessible from their website. And that is what you should be using in order to suggest that you have created a VPAT. Now, do you have to use an VPAT? We'll get to that later. But if you are using and saying, the word Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, and that is what you're basing it on, then you have to use the templates that come from ITI. Okay. So that's sort of a small snippet of the report. But there is actually more involved. I mean, this is the reporting aspect of it. One of the questions you may have is like, how do I get a VPAT report? What are the steps of this? Well, the first thing is you need to have an accessibility audit, right? So it'd be an auditor who would come and evaluate the content and the functionality of your product. And the results of that audit are what is entered into the VPAT. Quite often, when you get somebody who does an audit, they are auditing it against WCAG 2.2, 2.1, 2.0, whatever you've dictated, and the conformance level. And those results can then quite readily easily be transferred into that WCAG table, which is the second section in the VPAT. And then from that, you can fill out the rest of the sections from that information. But that accessibility audit is the key. So when you're doing an audit, one of the first things you have to do is choose your accessibility standards, as we've kind of been talking about. So this is what's relevant to your potential customers or the regions where you do business. Now, the easiest standards to choose is all of them. And that's because it will always include WCAG level A and level AA. And you will then include WCAG 2.2, will include all of 2.1 and 2.0. And they include section 508 for US public sector, include 301549 for EU. So if you choose the international standard and you use 2.2 level AA, you will cover pretty much everything, right? So if you are specific, say, and you choose, I only want to do section 508, which is WCAG 2.0 AA, well, then if you want to potentially sell your product to somebody in the EU, well, now you have to go back and you have to do more work, and you have to do the WCAG 2.1 success criteria. In addition to the 2.0, you have to fill out different sections. So really, ideally, do it all at once. Do the entire thing, a full international VPAT, and then you've got all of your bases covered. After we've chosen what level of conformance we're going to test to, we have to identify a sufficient sample for testing. And it has to be a representative of the different page layouts, the different types of content, and key functionality of your product. And we really don't want to make sure that we don't forget certain functions, because these are essential for the US and the EU accessibility standards. So product documentation, which is like online help, support services, such as online chat supports or even regular phone support. There's some specific criteria for supporting users with disabilities. with an authoring tool, like most people think of an authoring tool is a dedicated tool, like a website builder or a content management system. But for these standards, it's anything that allows users to create or modify content. So a rich text editor would be included in that. And then third-party code and content are important for all standards, right, including WCAG. So even if you don't write the code, you choose the vendor, so you become responsible for the integrated product, right? So if you're using third-party content in your site, as soon as you have integrated into your product, you're now responsible for how accessible it is. So, you know what? It's pretty important that you ask your third-party vendors for their VPATs and their accessibility conformance reports, so you know how accessible they are before you integrate them into your own product. All right, now, so you know what standards you're testing to, you know what sample you're testing. Now, how do you go about testing it effectively? Well, testing is not just automated testing, it's also manual and human technical evaluation, right? So in the testing procedures typical to auditing for accessibility involve automated testing, which an example of that could be ARC Toolkit is something by TPGi. It's a browser extension, sort of a one-click evaluation of the page that the browser is currently on, and it flags maybe 20 to 30% of errors. Automated testing can't do more than that. There's a lot of things that have to happen through other types of testing, manual testing. So examples of manual testing could be using a keyboard on its own to see if you can navigate through your site and be able to perform all the functionality that's important. It could be markup examination, especially when it comes to websites. So looking using maybe the Chrome or Firefox developer tools to inspect the code, make sure it's being coded correctly. And then using assistive technology to test. So for example, a screen reader. Different types of screen readers listed here. So there's JAWS and NVDA. Those are Windows-based screen readers, and VoiceOver is Mac-based. So an accessibility audit has lots of things that go into it. So with all those in place, you know, what will make it that this VPAT is one that has really good quality and is something that your customers can trust, right? One of the first things is to make sure you disclose the testing methodology, you know, as we talked about in that information page, the first section of the VPAT. We have to make sure we're providing clear remarks to justify the ratings that have been given. And in most cases, we'd actually recommend that you work with a reputable third-party auditor, right? So in addition to good quality testing and reporting, you know, customers who may be looking to, you know, buy accessible may recognize a name. So for instance, TPGi, you know, is one of our primary functions is to audit and consult on the accessibility of websites, and we are well known in the industry. And so if your customers see that a VPAT's been created by TPGi, they will have, you know, a higher level of trust in that VPAT. We also want to remember that the VPAT lists the testing date and the product version. So we want to make sure that we keep up with the current version of your product. And this can be challenging. And so, you know, as was asked earlier about, you know, software as a solution or software as a service solutions where the product is constantly updated. You do your best to keep it up to date as possible. So with a typical website, perhaps on every major release, you would refresh your VPAT. Same thing with software. If you have even maybe perhaps a minor release, you may want to do the updates then. But you just want to make sure that it is up to date with the current state of your product. Yeah. And then, you know, maybe ask, okay, so accessibility is essential for the buyers and users, and maybe you're just starting on your accessibility journey. So, you know, a common question that comes up is what happens if the VPAT report lists accessibility problems? which is typical. I mean, it's rare for sites to have no accessibility issues. Unfortunately, that's the case, but it is true. But really, first piece of advice is focus on the end user experience for people with disabilities and not just checking off the boxes in the VPAT. But while you're working on those accessibility improvements, some buyers can still accept your product. So for example, US government buyers, they can select a product which is the one that best meets the requirements. Right. So if you do have issues, it's important that you still create that VPAT. You still show that, because as we mentioned before, it shows that you have put a focus on accessibility. You make it public where the issues are, but you can also offer that plan of like, all right, so these are what our issues are. Here's our plan to fix them. This information is all really great for your users or potential buyers, potential customers, because they can see, okay, there are some issues right now, but we see that they are working towards fixing these issues, and within 4 months or 6 months, they're going to have the majority of these things fixed, and that's really great information for your customers to know. Okay, so now we know what's in a VPAT and how to get one. So next question is when? When should we get a VPAT? Well, first, let's answer the question, do I need a VPAT? And I guess the answer to that is yes and no. So the V in VPAT does stand for voluntary. All right, so the accessibility of your product, that is a legal requirement. Okay, there's legislation in place. Your product has to be accessible. But a specific report on that level of accessibility is not a legal requirement. Now, there are certain situations, such as mentioned a few times, if the US public sector is looking to purchase a product, then they do require a VPAT with Section 508. But if you are not selling to the federal government, you don't need to have this. It is not a requirement. But it still is, I think, important to have this. Again, it's that transparency and that understanding what the current state is of accessibility on your product. And when you do create a VPAT, you can either post it on your website, have it readily available, or you can have it available, but just on request, right? Somebody is asking for the VPAT, you can then respond with that as attached as an email, however you like it. But it is up to you how you provide that information. So back to the original question, when to prepare a VPAT report. So we could wait until a customer asks for one. But the problem with that is that you do need to audit in order to get that done, and that takes a long time. Auditing is not a quick practice. It's quite involved, so that could take some time. And the other risk is that you actually don't know what the accessibility status is of your product. You may be making claims that aren't actually true. So the other option is perhaps you just audit, have that information ready, and then just use start on the VPAT when you're asked. Well, again, that takes some time. You may have some additional problems or questions that you need to answer, and you may get out of the running for selling your product. But really, ideally, you want to report proactively. Have that VPAT or have the accessibility audit complete. Write your VPAT, and then keep that VPAT up to date. Right. As I just said, get an accessibility audit, improve the product accessibility, prepare the VPAT report and update it regularly, inform your current users of your accessibility progress, and with all that, gain a competitive advantage. Okay. Now, looking at some of the questions that are still up here. Do the VPAT auditors require some type of certification or training, or anyone can do a VPAT audit? So yeah, there are no requirements around the individuals that are doing the audit and creating the VPAT. It could be anybody. You can write one yourself. You can have somebody within your company write it. There are no requirements there. But the one issue with that is that unless you have some way of, I guess, showing credentials, not really credentials, but like just have a way of describing that the person who did the auditing and did the report has a certain level of knowledge and understanding. If you don't have that, then some maybe look at that VPAT and wonder if it's actually accurate. So as I mentioned, having a third-party company come in and do the audit on your behalf is always a good way to gain trust, because especially if it's a recognized name in the industry, as they're by them being a accessibility professionals, the trust will be higher in that sense. But if you have somebody on your team who knows accessibility and perhaps they even have some IAAP certification for accessibility, and that you want to state that on the report, you absolutely can do that. You can provide as much of it, a ton of information in that opening part of the report to explain how the auditing was done, who did it, how you get to that point. Any of that additional information will help build that trust. But there is no actual it must be somebody with this certification, or it must be somebody with this. There's no rules around that. Any formal government regulation that requires a VPAT audit on government or public product, or is it completely voluntary? So there is in the US, the regulation is that you must provide a VPAT. Because they are, all of their products are supposed to meet WCAG 2.0 AA. And therefore, if they are purchasing a product, or they are using federal money to create a product, or if there's any sort of federal involvement in ICT products, then the expectation is that they are WCAG 2.0 AA compliant, and therefore when they use a VPAT to help determine that. So there is that. It is a government regulation in that sense. For public institutions, it is not a requirement. Again, this is just the reporting side of things. VPATs is just reporting. There are different legislation around the world based on public and private institutions who, what level of conformance you must have. Those are never in question, and that is very separate than the VPAT. The VPAT is just a report on how conformant your product is. We have some vendors who fail to remove the instructions from their ACRs or VPATs. Is it fair or appropriate to call them on this detailed oversight? I would leave that up to you. Part of your determination whether something is, maybe they're not detail oriented, and maybe that'd be a reason that you don't want to use their product. But I don't see that as any sort of violation of anything. Again, it's a voluntary report, and so you would use your own judgment on whether they've done it appropriately or not. So is an audit done by a third party better than a self-done one, even if you have certification? Again, it's about recognition, name recognition sometimes, but it's not to say that you shouldn't. If you have the knowledge that you can do the audit and do the VPAT, then by all means do it. I think it becomes quite clear to somebody who is familiar with accessibility and with VPATs that I could look at two different VPATs. If one's written by somebody who doesn't have a lot of accessibility knowledge, I will know quite easily. So there's you can tell by the remarks and explanations of the from the auditing whether somebody fully understands the accessibility needs. And so you can, again, it's like you can make that evaluation as a buyer. You can make the evaluation. You read something, you say, okay, it was done by an individual within the company, do I want to trust this? Well, let me read it. Okay, this does make sense. It's a lot of really good information, so I think it's fine. And in particular, there's the other aspect of this, which we get asked a lot, is like, okay, if we have a VPAT that's written by, say, us, by TPGi, we've done the audit, we did a VPAT, we delivered that to a client, and now it's in their possession, they have it up on their website. Okay, great. Now they have a release on their website. They've updated a bunch of stuff, they fixed a whole bunch of accessibility items. Question is, does TPGi have to do the update to the VPAT, or can they do it internally? Either works. TPGi does not have to be the one to do it. Once it's in your possession, you can do updates to it, but then TPGi or whatever the third party is that did the initial one may not back up the findings. Now you've taken that as an internal document, something that you've created or edited, and now the responsibility is on the individual. But there's nothing to say that you can't do that, and then actually it's quite common, right? So if you've done some updates, to go and update your VPAT, and you don't necessarily need to engage that third party again, when maybe what you're doing is like, here's this one line item in the VPAT that was a problem. We fixed that. We can now say that it's supported. There's no point in getting a third party involved back in that. I found a comment here. I found that the first part of the VPAT is typically the most helpful. How much or little info provided about the testing methods, the tester's ability, disability, contact info, or lack of really speaks volumes. Yes, I agree with that. If somebody's really taken a lot of care and filled out a lot of information in that, the initial section for the product information, lots of detail around testing methodologies and who the tester is and all those types of things, if they've done their due diligence in that realm, that you can. It speaks volumes as to how careful they would have been in putting together the VPAT. Question: can we modify the VPAT template? For example, create a separate column for conformance level to sort. I would suggest that you don't, because as soon as you've done that, you've now broken away from the template that it's that structure that everybody's looking for. If you've sorted yours in a certain way, you've changed the order of the information, could become confusing if somebody's trying to evaluate 5 different products using 5 different VPATs. You don't want your formatting to go off. And I expect that if you do change the formatting, that the official use of VPAT may not be allowed, because now it's broken away from the actual template. Question: I'm new to accessibility testing, learning through online resources. So basic question is, can we provide any sample free VPAT report for reference purposes with the audit report? So I can suggest there are lots of larger organizations that do put their VPATs readily available for anybody to look at, and Adobe is one of them. Adobe has VPATs for other products that are available on their website. So if you want to see a complete VPAT as an example, you can go to Adobe and look at theirs. Now, to a sample between the audit report and the VPAT, there's no specific way to go about doing that. I mean, really, when you do an audit and you are looking at, say, if you've got a sample size of, say, 20 components, because that covers off, that's a representative sample. Well, you're going to report on 20 different samples of whether something meets non-text content, and so you'll have 20 cells, or if you got a spreadsheet perhaps you're using, you got 20 different answers to whether non-text content passes in each one of those 20 components. You then have to just kind of gather that information up and transfer it into the table, in the VPAT. And there's no standardized way of doing that, really. So I couldn't provide you any sort of like a reference between an audit report and the VPAT. But if you want to go look at a complete VPAT, Adobe is a good place to go. A lot of the bigger companies will have that quite readily available. Any items in the VPAT that are not in WCAG, can the VPAT be used for physical products or digital? So there are sections within the VPAT having to do with software, hardware, documentation, and help. And so these could come in different forms. So hardware in particular, there are aspects to it that it is used to cover any, as I said, information and communication technology. And that does include things like, could include things like a telephone system or an actual kiosk or a PC. And it's not necessarily about the software that's running, but the actual device, it's a hardware device itself. And so they won't be covered by WCAG. So that there are sections within those other parts of the VPAT that you would have to answer directly based on your findings of doing a sort of a separate audit. Those things tend to be a little more matter of fact. So one of the ones for hardware I mentioned was whether something requires reach. Okay, so if you have a hardware product, like I guess a kiosk is probably a good example, that part of the functionality is high up on the kiosk, and somebody who may be seated in a wheelchair may not be able to reach it, and so that would be that does not support somebody who cannot reach. So there's aspects like that you would need to fill out. They tend to be a little bit more based in sort of the physical space and less abstract as WCAG can be. So the guidelines, the WCAG guidelines can be a little bit abstract in how they're described, but the other ones, they tend to be a little bit more based in sort of physical space and whatnot. Can you have a VPAT that passes testing but fails WCAG standards? So VPAT is not about passing. VPAT is a report. It is stating the current state of accessibility of your product. And so if you have any sort of failures within WCAG based on what the report is, then the VPAT would reflect that failure. There is no sort of passing when it comes to the VPAT. Again, the VPAT is just an explanation, it's just a report of the accessibility. It is possible for you to have, say, if you are creating a VPAT for Section 508 that only requires WCAG 2.0 AA, that you have you have failures in WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 success criteria, but because they don't apply to that particular version of the report, it would show as being compliant, that your report is showing that your site is compliant to WCAG 2.0 AA, even though your site would not necessarily be compliant to 2.1 or 2.2. So there's a possibility in that realm. But again, the VPAT is just reporting. It's not passing or failing. It's just reporting on what the audit has brought out. Okay, lots of great questions. Really appreciate that. I don't see any more here. Last chance.
Yep, doesn't seem like we have any additional questions. I just want to thank everyone for attending today. If you do have additional questions or need assistance with the VPAT or any additional accessibility assistance, please reach out to Ida at tpgi.com. That's IDA at tpgi.com. And again, thanks everyone for your time today. We please keep an eye out for our next upcoming webinars. I believe we have another one coming up next week. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.